Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last day of the conference. So my presentation this morning is related to using LinkedIn Learning as a tool to nudge both lifelong learning in undergraduate students, as well as pushing their metacognitive tendencies. And I'd like to share the approach that I took, and hopefully it will help people to consider that for their own courses. So without further ado, let me just kind of go through the agenda for you. I want to first of all just briefly acknowledge our Indigenous land, and I'll do that in a second. Then I want to talk just quickly about what LinkedIn Learning is. I think most audience members are well aware of it, being that this is a Learning Ideas Conference online. Why I went using LinkedIn Learning for this approach, and how I then incorporated it in my courses. Then I want to share some research outcomes from that, from 2 different courses in 2 different years and cohorts. And then lastly, I want to share some lessons learned if this is something that you think to adopt in your own course. So first, what I'd like to do before I dive in, I want to recognize our Indigenous lands and people. I'd like to begin to acknowledge that I'm a settler of Scottish descent, and I'm a guest on the traditional territory between the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations, recognized with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And as a descendant of European settlers, I have a responsibility towards reconciliation with all Indigenous people, and recognize that I'm privileged to live and work on their territory. May I also suggest that we all need to focus on our friendship and right actions to transform our relationship with our Indigenous friends and neighbors. So thank you for that. So again, I would suggest that most people are pretty familiar with LinkedIn Learning. I don't know if you know much of the history. It started as lynda.com back in 1995, a husband and wife team working in the digital arts area. And it has, of course, expanded into 3 major categories of online learning: creative industries, business, and of course, technology. Back in 2015, in the spring of 2015, it was acquired by LinkedIn for about 1.5 billion. So a nice ticket that way. And then a year later, Microsoft purchased LinkedIn and for a little over 26 billion, and incorporated that into their suite of tools. And of course, in October 2017, it was rebranded from lynda.com to LinkedIn Learning. And it has, of course, just a plethora of online resources done by industry professionals and academics that are readily available 24/7, and it's constantly being updated. And of course, these are all very professionally done that way. One of the things that, of course, with LinkedIn Learning is you can get an individual license to use that if you're on LinkedIn and pay that price. There are also enterprise level licenses. And luckily, within the province of Ontario, Canada, where I am, we have an organization called eCampus Ontario. And back in 2017, they paid for an enterprise license for all universities and colleges within Ontario, which is 44 institutions in total. And that ran for 3 years, and then they extended the license for 1 more year because that was the beginnings of COVID. And then after that fact, the license expired. They did not renew it. And so what happened is my university, McMaster University, took on their own enterprise license. They formed what they called a Save the LinkedIn Learning Group. And they negotiated a license to be able to do that, including a number of other universities in Ontario did the same thing, about 12 in total. And they have a goal to reach a level of about 50% usage of this across the university by all stakeholders who have access to that. So that's students, faculty, and staff, and they have access to this resource for free. Currently, the adoption rate is around 27%. And if we compare that with American universities, the activation rate is usually around 20%, so we're a little bit above that. But what we'd like to do, of course, is get much higher in using that, both as an individual learning resource, but also within our classrooms, like I did that as well. Now, an enterprise license is not inexpensive. It's quite costly, so depending on the size of the institution, that might be quite challenging. I know ours is a little over $500,000 for our 3-year contract, so that's quite an expensive burden for many schools, depending on their size. So I want to give, if this is something you're interested in as a potential, a little bit of a hack, is many local libraries, also public library systems throughout North America and Europe, have access to LinkedIn Learning. You'd have to check your local library. But if it is something that your university or college does not have access to, this might be a way that you could still utilize it in your courses by having students go to their local library digitally. They don't have to physically go there. They can do it online and get a license. So it's something to check. And the community that I live in is only 150,000 people. It's a place called Guelph, Ontario. It's just north of Hamilton, where our university is. And our local public library has a LinkedIn Learning license. So it gives you an idea of the size that is available. So it's just something to consider as a little bit of a hack. So I teach in an engineering program, but I teach management to engineering undergraduate and graduate students. And as we know that the professional climate is changing, not only for technical or engineering professionals, but for all professionals. And of course, the material that we are teaching them at the undergraduate level, by the time they get out into industry, some of that is starting to fade away. And so they need to really adopt the habits to become lifelong learners. And in order to do that, we have to kind of set the stage for them to do that. And that's one of the key elements of why I wanted to use LinkedIn Learning, was to start this as kind of a nudge to show them that there are resources available that they can use out in industry, whether their employers paying for this or they're doing it on their own, to get them into that habit. And another key component as a professional course is to be able to reflect on your learning. What are the things that went well, and what are the things that could be improved on to make you a better professional moving forward? So in order to enhance this awareness, what I decided to do was adopt LinkedIn Learning in 2 of my courses to begin this journey, or this nudge to get my students in that direction. So I officially started this in the fall of 2018, pre-COVID, when we were in the classroom and had another assignments related to this, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then, of course, I continued that when all institutions move to an online environment. So it can work both in a classroom environment or in an online virtual environment that way. Now, as you know, the idea that we can measure lifelong learning, that's a little challenging because, of course, students have left our institution by that point in time. My goal was to begin this process with them, as I said earlier, kind of a nudge to make that happen. So the 2 courses I integrated this into one was a 4th-year entrepreneurial thinking and innovation course. And I started that in the fall of 2018, but the data I'm going to share with you is from the fall 2019, pre-COVID. This course is a senior level course. It's not a capstone, but it is starting to accumulate. There are a total of 13 management courses within our undergraduate curriculum. And this course takes students on a journey to start to sort of enhance their thinking about how to look for problems and opportunities within organizations. And really the course's framework is about building a business case to communicate to senior individuals in a real organization about a real problem or opportunity that would receive resources such as funding, personnel, etc., to move that solution forward. And I asked students, of course, to reach out with the experience of their previous workplace co-ops for real organizations with real problems or opportunities to embrace. So it's a very much a hands-on practical course. There are the framework of the topics relate to building the business case along the way, and then there are a number of presentations that the students do with a final report and final presentation related to that. This second course I introduced this into was a second-year management principles course, which is more of a fundamentals course on, the key elements of management within technical organizations, such as leading, controlling, planning, etc. So very much a foundational course. So two very different cohorts that I introduced this into. Now, how I integrated this into the program was via an assignment. And the assignment had two parts. First, the students, I selected 3 LinkedIn learning courses that were due throughout the semester. And the students had to watch those LinkedIn courses on their own and then put together a brief summary, assuming the summary was going to be read by someone who had never been in the course themselves. So it was an idea of kind of, I don't know the age group of everybody, but this idea of a Cole's note, so to speak, or an executive summary of the course, trying to keep it to a maximum of about 3 pages or 1,500 words. The second part of the assignment was to reflect on the LinkedIn course and how students could incorporate the learning from that into either their education moving forward or within experiences that they've had out in the workplace, either as a co-op opportunity, a volunteer opportunity, or a part-time job. And the idea then was to try to push or nudge their metacognitive skills and to increase their learning agency that way. I had a number of other goals or report aims for this. Of course, I picked LinkedIn learning courses that complemented the topic areas that I was teaching in the course. I didn't want it to be a replacement to me, but to be kind of a shoulder learning opportunity for the students, and so that they could enhance their skills related to those things. As I've talked about, I wanted to help them enhance their summarizing skills because that's important as professionals moving forward. Of course, the reflection skills. As I said earlier on, I wanted to introduce them to the LinkedIn learning platform as a tool to enhance their lifelong learning. And then the other thing, and I don't know if you've experienced this in your own courses, when we talk about a topic that is important to students, we may or may not get their engagement. And then we bring on a guest speaker, or we bring on, a senior student into a junior student course, and they say something very similar, and all of a sudden, all the students go, "Oh yeah, that's so important," even though we as instructors might have been talking about that all the way along. And of course, those are the idea of hearing other voices. And I wanted the students to experience other working professionals, experts in their field, talking about topics that were similar that they were using in their course to enhance their learning as well. And one of our program level objectives is about the focus of conducting themselves in a responsible manner through lifelong learning. And again, this was a beginning of nudging that process. So those were the goals that I had for this assignment through these courses. Coming up on the screen now is the rubric that I shared with you. It, again, divided up 50% for the summarizing component, 35% towards the reflection, and of course 15% for, wordsmithing, grammar, spelling, etc. And I'll share my contact information at the end, and I'd be happy to share this rubric with anyone afterwards if you want to reach out to me that way. And TAs graded these LinkedIn Learning tutorial assignments, and I made sure that they were timely in nature, that they gave feedback, so the students had plenty of time before the next LinkedIn Learning tutorial was due, so they could incorporate their learning from and feedback from the TAs, not only from the rubric, but comments that they made about their report. And just briefly, for my Entrepreneurial Thinking and Innovation course, these are the 3 LinkedIn Learning tutorials that I use. The first one, writing a business case, which gave students an overview. Then solving business problems was more about thinking about problems and opportunities. And then the last one was presenting as a team, because there was lots of presentations within this course. I have since swapped some of these out. I've swapped the last one, for instance, to becoming an entrepreneur inside a company, based on some feedback, which I'll share with you in just a second. The other course that, in the management principles course, again, it's more foundational, was being an effective team member, giving and receiving feedback, and of course, Management Foundations was the last LinkedIn tutorial, which kind of was a summary type of course, which helped the students kind of embrace many of the concepts that I taught in the course, and it gave them kind of that sort of foundation or summary of everything that was going on. So what I'd like to do, I conducted a number of surveys with both cohorts, and I want to share with you the output of that, or the results of that, to give you a flavor of the students' thinking around using LinkedIn Learning. So in the Entrepreneurial Thinking and Innovation course, which was my 4th year course, I had a participation rate of almost 45%, 85 students in the course, and 38 of them completed the survey. In my Management Principles course, not quite as high a participation rate, a little under 34%. I had a total of 250 students in that course, and I got 86 to fill out the survey. And one of the things I wanted to ask in this question was, was this the first time they used a LinkedIn Learning platform? And as you can see, pre-COVID in fall of 2019, only a handful of students had used LinkedIn Learning as part of a graded assignment, only 3%. Majority had not. But as we move into the COVID era and course institutions moved online, we see that there is a bit of an increase. Again, this was early, the winter of 2021, so it would have been sort of the first year that way. But again, not a huge adoption rate across the university, but I can see that some of my students in some of their other technical courses started to use LinkedIn Learning. So that went up to about 9% that had used it in a graded assignment within a course. I have since done this survey again in the winter of 2022, and in my Entrepreneurial Thinking and Innovation course, it moved to a winter semester. That actually has gone up to almost 30%. So there is slowly an adoption rate of using this within not only my courses, but across other undergraduate curriculums in the W. Booth School of Engineering, Technology, and Practice, where I teach at McMaster University. The other thing I was interested in was, did they find the LinkedIn Learning program easy to use? And in the fall of 2019, some of the students reported, just 13% of them, that they found some frustration with it, where it was quite low in the winter of 2021. Those students didn't really run into any problems. And one of the issues that I think it was a little higher, 13% in 2019, is there was something in lynda.com, and it is still in LinkedIn Learning, where students can use a tool to summarize the actual video tutorial and export actually write it in real time as they're watching, and then export those notes. There was a problem with exporting the notes. The students got quite frustrated with that. So after the first assignment, I basically told them to abandon that and just do their notes in a regular fashion, whether using 2 screens or another device, that way that they could make their notes. And that seemed to alleviate the problem. But again, that led to some challenges. Then I wanted to survey the students about what they thought of the grading criteria, as well as the actual 3 assignments that they had to do. Certainly, there seemed to be, they strongly agreed that the grading criteria was appropriate for the type of course. Almost 88% thought that was positive. The first 2 LinkedIn Learning tutorials, again, pretty strong presence there, almost equal at 79% of strongly agree that they were helpful. The last one didn't quite hit the mark. It was a little bit lower. And some of the feedback I got from students within the classroom was they felt that they were senior students, they had done a lot of presentations, and this wasn't really worthwhile to keep doing that moving forward. And so they felt that it was a little bit of a waste of their time that way. If I go into the second year course, the Management Principles course, again, the grading criteria was very positively received that way. And all the LinkedIn Learning tutorials seem to get a strong response in a positive sense from the students, especially the last one on management foundations. And that speaker was quite dynamic, and that was a very nicely laid out course. So the students really appreciated that. And just qualitatively, they liked it because it became kind of a summary of the course near the end, which was helpful for their study efforts. The other thing I wanted to measure was, would they be using LinkedIn Learning outside of courses? And again, this was trying to measure whether kind of that nudge to incorporate lifelong learning. In the 2019 cohort, just under 32% said they were extremely or very likely to do that. And then that grew to almost 48% in the 2021 cohort. So almost a 16% increase that way. Now, of course, they don't know whether they're going to use this after they graduate or whether they even have access to it, but it is starting to indicate that there is a trend towards using that as a platform. The other thing I wanted to check in was there is an opportunity that they can, once they complete the course, that they can share a digital certificate out in their social media, whether that's on the LinkedIn Learning profile, Facebook, etc. And I found that the 2019 group, just over 32% were, again, extremely or very likely to do that. And then that grew quite a bit for the cohort in 2021 to well over 50%, 55%. So quite a positive difference. And I think that's because the 2021 cohort were sophomores, and it could kind of be rationalized because they wanted to enhance their professional profile to help secure workplace co-op opportunities, paid workplace co-op opportunities, which is a mandatory requirement within our engineering school. So that's probably a key element of that. And lastly, I wanted to measure whether they actually started to enhance their reflection or metacognitive skills. And I used the grading rubric to measure this. And what you see on the screen is, of course, is the increase between video tutorial 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and of course from video tutorial 1 all the way to video tutorial 3. And in both cases, the cohort in 2019, there was, just under, kind of 4.75% increase. So some learner agency, but much more positive in the second years that way. Not quite 15%, but moving up to that. So a beginning of enhancing their reflective abilities. And again, it's, as we know as professionals, that's quite challenging to do any way we look at it. And the last thing I want to do is just want to sort of share some of the limitations of my study. One was, of course, it was a small sample. It was reliant, of course, only on these 8 closed-ended questions. The survey didn't measure any longitudinal impact of lifelong learning. So certainly there's an opportunity there to continue the research. The questionnaire and survey didn't also measure self-efficacy, which is really a major factor towards embracing change and learning in individuals in their personal development. So that's also something that could be considered. And of course, the cohort in 2021 might have been influenced just overall with institutions moving to a digital or virtual learning environment. And lastly, I just want to share with you quickly before we move to questions, if it's something you're considering in your own course, some lessons learned that I got out of this is one is try to keep LinkedIn learning courses, your choices, no longer than 45 minutes in total. They're broken up into smaller segments, but the whole course. Actually, the sweet spot is around 30 minutes because we are dealing with the YouTube generation. I also would recommend starting with lower stake assignments at the beginning, worth a little bit less, so students can learn from those without being sort of jeopardized from a mark perspective. If you have an opportunity to provide some pre-reflective practice, because it's not something we generally do, especially in engineering that way, make sure your LinkedIn learning tutorials reflect the objectives and scope of your course, but don't substitute you, kind of be a shoulder that way. It's also key that you give detailed feedback on these assignments via either yourself as an instructor or your TAs. And then I would also suggest that maybe enhancing or putting a reflection question on your final exam. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. My contact information is here. If you'd like to reach out and you have any further questions, I'd be happy to connect with people that way. And be happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Very interesting presentation. I was not very familiar with this, the LinkedIn learning platform, and now I learn a lot from you. So now it's time of questions. And see any question in the Q&A panel. As I mentioned here in the panel, if anyone would like to tell a question rather than write them in the panel, which is sometimes complicated to keep a discussion writing questions. So let me know and I will move to on a stage during the questions and you can ask directly to the presenter, okay? So in the meantime, we see some questions. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, because of course, this platform looks like very, very interesting, and it's a pity that maybe not many people know or is using them because of the reasons you mentioned. No? Maybe first the cost, of course, that is a barrier. But then also, I think it could be somehow foster the use of the platform by enhancing the concept of certificates or digital badges, as you mentioned. You may know that the idea of the concept of micro-credentials is quite fashionable nowadays, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But that provides evidence of the well, sometimes short or very specialized pieces of knowledge that you can provide evidence to companies or other institutions that you have these competencies and skills. So I'm not sure if the LinkedIn learning platform provides this kind of credentials.
It does. So the students get a digital certificate. So they have their different types of courses on LinkedIn Learning. The ones I picked, as I said earlier, I tried to keep to a maximum of 45 minutes. But there are more in-depth courses on LinkedIn Learning that are, can go for, 2 or 3 hours on a number of topic areas. Let's say lean management, in engineering, design thinking, those types of things. And again, the students can get those digital certificates and put them into some sort of social media. And I try to connect with many of my students on LinkedIn Learning or LinkedIn, just because I want to keep in touch with them after they graduate. And it was always nice to see many of them putting that on their platform. And some have even come back and said that during interviews with employers, they asked about the courses, or they got an opportunity to get an interview for a co-op job because of those types of digital certificates.
Yeah, actually, it's quite interesting. Actually, my university now, we are starting a project, a European project, but how to standardize this kind of micro-credentials so that they are recognized by employers and institutions in general. So I think that could be interesting to join to this kind of big projects, so that everyone in the world can somehow recognize the same type of credentials.
I would agree, and we're doing exactly the same thing at our university too. So it's interesting.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Great. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you very much.